Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb. Becky Scher is off on maternity leave, so you're stuck with just me this week, but I promise we have a fantastic episode lined up. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Rochelle Olson, a longtime journalist and current opinion columnist for the Star Tribune. Rochelle has spent decades covering Minnesota politics from inside out, reporting on Minneapolis and St. Paul city halls, Hennepin and Ramsey County governments, the courts, and the state capitol. Before joining the Star Tribune in 2000, Rochelle honed her journalistic chops with the Associated Press, covering politics and policy from Kansas City to West Virginia. A proud Bloomington native, she's a graduate of Hamline University with a master's degree from the University of Kansas. Today, Rochelle joins us to talk about her extensive and impressive career in journalism and what it's like transitioning from reporting to opinion writing. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. I am very excited today to be speaking with Rochelle Olson from the Star Tribune, from the bowels of the state capitol. Thank you so much for taking time to join me today.
Of course. I've known you a long time. This will be fun.
I'm really looking forward to this. And one of the reasons why that triggered this is you worked for 25 years in reporting, and we're going to talk about a lot of what you've covered in the past, but you just transitioned to the editorial columnist side. Talk about that transition and what prompted it and what changes in terms of your reporting style, your approach.
That's a big question. What prompted it? I guess it was a new opportunity. I mean, I'm sure, as you can appreciate, I was a reporter for a long time. I was a reporter at the Star Tribune for 25 years. I was a reporter with the Associated Press for 8 years before that. So what is that, almost 30 years? And I guess it was just a new opportunity at the Star Tribune to join the editorial board and write opinion columns. And that always has been something that's been of interest to me, but the right opportunity just never came up. And there's been a lot of change at the Star Tribune recently, and the opportunity sort of presented itself, and it seemed like a good fit for me, especially because I could stay at the Capitol and continue to cover politics and government, which is something that I've done a lot of in my career. Literally, I joked about it at the beginning. I think I first met you in 1996 when you were a baby with the Republican Party and I was a baby with the Associated Press here at the Capitol. So it's been a long time. And I feel like it's been an interesting transition. It's maybe, I don't know if I would say it's a little harder than I thought it would be. It is very strange to go from your whole career as a reporter and you're trying to be balanced and fair to both sides, to suddenly I'm writing things and not only am I allowed to have opinion, I'm kind of supposed to have an opinion, encouraged to have an opinion. And so I think in some ways there's been a lot of, as I am handling this transition, a lot of times I'll write something and I'll be like, that's written very much like a news story. And I'll in my mind, rewrite it before I turn it in, thinking that I can add a little more attitude and take a position. And it's both fun and weird, again, after all this time of sanding down the edges of those things, of my sort of view of the world or what's happening here. So it's still an adjustment. I still find myself rewriting a lot to infuse more of that into what I do. And it's also, sometimes I'll literally have to give myself a pep talk and say, this is what you're supposed to be doing right now, is having an opinion. And it's a shift. And it's also weird in terms of, as a reporter, again, you're trying to be even-handed about what you're writing about. And now as an opinion columnist and taking a position on things, then it's different in your interactions with people to some degree, because you're going to write, it's going to happen more often that I will probably write things that people disagree with. And even people I like may do something that I don't like. And again, it's just my opinion, but so that's also been an interesting thing to navigate in terms of, before, when I was doing reporting, it could be like, okay, that came off that way. That wasn't, because people get upset about what you write no matter what you write. And people will read things bring their own perspective to whatever story you write, and they'll think you were being too hard on them. And I'm going back to the news side now. People aren't always happy with the news stories I would write, of course. Any news story, it's hard to be written about. But it's different now because it's all out there in terms of Michael Brodkorb is the jerk, which I've never written, by the way. But then
others have.
That is true. That is true. But they've said the same thing about me. It's just part of the deal. But then I would have to, at some point, probably talk to you again, and maybe we would have to have that conversation and say I didn't like what you did or what you said or whatever. And so it's a different way. In some ways, I'm still very much navigating that, but it's in some ways it almost makes some relationships a little trickier, a little maybe pricklier. It's a little bit bigger transition than maybe I thought it would be, because I thought, oh, I'll still be at the Capitol. I'm familiar with the Capitol. But
I always considered you to be tough but fair. And you also were someone who, there's pushback that happens when you're doing straight news stories. And so when I saw it happening, I'm like, this is going to be great, because I thought it would be an easier transition, but it seems to not be as liberating as maybe it doesn't seem to be that way right away. Correct?
I think partly what I'm saying, in some ways it is, because let me give you an example. Something I covered the trial. We'll go right to something big in the news.
Yep.
I covered 2 trials for the former police officers convicted of killing George Floyd. And those were just absolutely horrific. As anybody who watched a few minutes of it, I would hope we know that not everyone sees it that way. And I think having watched those, and it's clear to me what happened, and I think about it all the time. I saw that video dozens of times from various different angles, played in courtrooms, and I will, for the rest of my life, that will be with me. And that was a lot to watch. It's very difficult. What I viewed as the cruelty and the inhumanity of it, and yet here we are. Some people don't see it that way. They think Derek Chauvin should be pardoned, or that somehow George Floyd was responsible for his own murder. But so in that sense, that one is a pretty clear cut one where I can be angrily say these former officers committed murder, and they were convicted of murder. But so that's a pretty clear cut one where I can say that, and I feel 100% that I am accurate in that one. But I think a lot of things are much more nuanced. Life is much more nuanced than that. And I do feel bad. Like I said, I think and you know this from being around politics for so long, there are people that you like a great deal who you don't agree with politically. And sometimes if I'm writing a column like criticizing their political views or something, I don't want to, it's hard so it can be hard to write something about a person you like that is going to make their life difficult. But we do that all the time on the news side too. We write difficult stories. People we like do things we don't like all the time, and we have to write about it. And it's hard. And in some ways it's harder here because most of these people here at the Capitol are great. They're fun on a personal level, but that doesn't mean that you like how they operate politically or their political positions. And so it's just hard as a human being you have, even having been a reporter for as long as I have, it's hard to make someone's life more difficult, or I don't know, maybe, but there would be people who would tell you that being criticized by a Star Tribune columnist is a badge of honor. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I don't know. But it's just, I think there's a recognition from having been in this business so long, and our relationship is a great example. We've known each other a long time through various ups and downs, and you can have a lot of respect for a person and still have to write something difficult about them, and that's hard.
I completely understand that, and I completely understand that perspective. One thing I wanted to share with you, I don't think I've ever shared with you before, was I have, as wife, 3 kids. My daughters was the trial of Derek Chauvin was obviously live streamed, and we discussed it a lot in our house. And my daughters covered a lot of what you reported, and so they were introduced to you because you were writing so much about that trial. And one of the things that I was thinking about in prep for that is, I remember it was the first time it was a live stream trial, so we were seeing what was going on, but then there was also print coverage. And that was one of the first, I think, large news events as a family my wife and I had with our kids, and they read a lot of your stories. One of the things I was curious is how you have written about very tough subjects, trials, criminal trials in particular, too, which you mentioned. How do you handle that? How do you go home at night? Because you don't, you have a responsibility as your job to cover and sit and absorb a lot of the details that a lot of us didn't see. And then you're on the front lines dealing with people. How do you balance that toll, protecting yourself, your mental health, and your well being? Because some of the subjects you cover are just so tough.
Yeah, and it's not funny you asked that, but I was having a conversation on this exact topic last week with a colleague of mine who currently covers the courts at the paper, and we talked about how it's like anything. Some people, it's some people are going to absorb it differently. Some people are going to handle it differently. Me, in some ways, I feel like it wasn't just the Chauvin trial. It was I covered courts for 4 years, and that's a
Yep.
lot of you're
Kim
sitting in
Potter,
a
too.
Kim Potter too. I mean that was in that sort of that same zone, but it's like you're sitting that same time frame. But even before that, I spent 4 solid years in Hennepin County courts, and you're in courtrooms with these people who the families of murder victims, the families of people, usually young men, who are probably going to prison for a long time and altering the course of their lives. And so there's a lot of drama and a lot of pain. And some people can sit there and go write about it and be fine with it. Sorry. So it's like anything in life. Some people can sit there and shake it off and go home at night. I'm not one of those people. I think that when I'm covering stuff like that, I have to. We all know there's ways self care. There's good ways and there's bad ways. And there were certainly nights when I would go home and I would drink wine or something. But also that doesn't work in the long term. So you have to take care of yourself, as anybody does who's exposed to trauma. You have to exercise and drink lots of water and get sleep. It's I talked to a therapist before the Chauvin trial started. I talked to a crisis therapist because that was also coming off. We were in the middle of the pandemic. We were coming off the riots, and the Star Tribune had set up a situation where reporters could call and get a free hours of therapy, some free therapy. And I availed myself of that right before the trial because I knew I'd been talking to other reporters and I knew I had an inkling of how difficult it was going to be to go and cover that. And that was, and I wasn't sure I could do it. And the therapist said what I just told you. It's like, you just got to take care of yourself, that you've gotten through this stuff before, and you got to take care of yourself on a very basic level, which is, and now I say that whenever anybody, any of my friends or anybody's going through some major ordeal, it's like you really kind of have to go back to the basics of trying to eat healthy, trying to go for walks, spend time with my dog, drink lots of water, don't drink alcohol, just the basic self-care. There's no, and I do see a therapist, so that helps too.
Yeah. That was, I know it was a challenge. My wife and I, it was, again, live streamed the Chauvin trial and screening some of that content. It was very difficult to watch. And I can't imagine the toll it took just being there because you're also seeing things that the public isn't seeing. You're seeing the faces of people and the people in the crowd and the jury and the public and the people that are so directly impacted. It just takes a toll. And I just want to say, my compliments to you for your coverage of both of those, Derek Chauvin and Kimberly Potter, which are incredibly tough subjects to do. You also, though, you have covered the intersection of one of my favorite topics, which is sports and politics. Talk a bit about because those are two of my pretty much my favorite subjects in Minnesota is sports and politics. And you've had opportunities to travel and you've covered a lot of the behind the scenes of sports and politics at intersection Minnesota. Describe to our listeners how much fun that actually is, because I think it would be a blast. But what give some nuggets that we may not, us sports fans and political junkies might not know.
I can do that. And that is definitely, and that's another part of, you ask about how I handled covering courts or whatever. I always had this other beat on the side, and it was a totally different situation where you're talking to people from the sports teams in town. I talked a lot to the Vikings, and you're talking to people who are planning for the Super Bowl. So that was a nice antidote to all the serious, heavy stuff. But I don't know. I'll tell you one of my favorite things, and it's because I would cover these things, and I would cover the intersection of sports and politics, a little bit sports and business. I'm not covering the games on the field. So game time in some ways, by the time a game rolls around, a lot of my work was done. And I got to go to 3 Super Bowls, and the one here, yeah, I got to go to the one in San Francisco, and the one in San Francisco. I think of it by the head. That was the time that Beyonce and Bruno Mars and Coldplay were the halftime show in San Francisco, and then the one in Houston, which was Lady Gaga. As I say that, couple of the lead up to the Super Bowl, because it's this whole week, and you're in a hotel, and at least at the Houston one, you're in this bubble because I was in the NFL hotel, and so there was really not a lot of reason for me to go outside. I'd go to the events and suss it out because it was coming to the Twin Cities to get a sense of how it operates and how that might work in the Twin Cities. So a couple of days before the games, I tumbled to the fact that the halftime acts do press conferences. So I was like, these press conferences,
wow.
Yeah, with a couple. I didn't know about this. Somebody from the Vikings grabbed me and said, "Hey, do you want to go watch the Coldplay press conference?" I'm like, "Yeah, let's go." And it's literally like right down the hall. So there's Chris Martin from Coldplay, and I don't know, Luke Bryan or whoever. And Lady Gaga was at the one in Houston, which was actually, so you get to see, and I don't know if there's a couple hundred reporters in those rooms. It's not a huge room, but so it's fun to see these mega stars in a smaller room, and they are like, Chris Martin was fabulous and charming, and Lady Gaga was just insane, and Simone Biles was there, of all people, because she's from Houston, so she's like in the front row, and Lady Gaga's calling her out for all her great work on behalf of foster kids, and what's his face, the late night guy who used to do carpool karaoke. He's not on anymore. His parents were there as Super Bowl correspondents, and they were lovely, and that was fun. So you get that sort of behind and here, of course, it was Justin Timberlake, but he wasn't as, I don't know, he wasn't as incandescent as, say, Lady Gaga was, but. And of course, there's
incandescent.
Yeah, she was.
That's a 25-cent word.
She was, though. She's like one of those people that you're like, oh, I can see why she's a global superstar. But
Can I ask?
What?
No, go ahead. No, please go ahead. Keep going.
I was changing gears. And to say one of my favorite Super Bowl moments, though, was the Houston game. Again, most of my work is done. I'm not there covering the game, so I'm there as a tourist for the halftime show, but I'm sitting in my seat in the back of the press box. And if you remember how that game went, the Falcons just rolled. They looked like they were just going to steamroll the Patriots. This is when Tom Brady and Belichick are still the Patriots. And then the Patriots started coming back. And they came back, and the game goes into overtime. But it's funny because with, I don't know, I can't remember if it's 7 minutes left or 11 minutes left in the fourth quarter, they take reporters down to the press room underneath the stadium. And this is a rule regardless of where the game is. That's just, they run these things. The NFL obviously knows how to run these games, right? So they get you on these elevators, and you run in like Elton John's waiting outside an elevator. It's just, you're just seeing, he was in a wheelchair, and this was years ago, but he seems okay now. Anyway, but so they take you down to the bowels of the stadium, and you're watching the end of the game on these huge screens in this big room. And I'm thinking, I'm like, don't go into overtime. I want to get this done and go home. But it goes into overtime. Fine. And I'd been to the San Francisco one, so I knew how this was going to play out. So I'm going to go into the press room where they bring the winning coach and the winning quarterback. It's not super crowded because most reporters are on deadline and doing their work. But first, and I'm like, I'm just going to sit here in the second row. So I'm sitting like right there, and they bring in, and as if you recall, the Patriots did win that game. It was an insane comeback, and they won.
Absolutely.
And I think they brought in Belichick first, and he was, as you always see him, crabby as hell. Didn't crack a smile about anything.
There's not a soft side?
I don't know. And I'm sitting there, and I'm not asking questions because I felt kind of like I'm like a press room tourist. To this day, I wish I'd said something like, I wish I'd just thrown something out there like you would with a politician and been like, are you like gonna go out for dinner and celebrate? Are you happy about this? Because he looked so cranky, but I didn't. Then they brought in Tom Brady. And this was the one where, while his jersey was being stolen while he's doing this. But this was like a really cool moment because so they bring in Tom Brady and he's 10 feet from me, and I think I still have the video. But if you recall, again, that game went into overtime and they had to come back. And so this was Tom Brady coming off this incredible comeback, and he's just physically you can just feel he's still wearing that, that thing they wear on their forearm with all the plays on it.
Yep.
He's still wearing
Yep.
that thing. He's got, I don't know, he's got half his clothes on. He's got clothes on, but he's not wearing his jersey. He's just exhausted, but also you exhilarated. So you're like he's having this like peak sort of experience, and and that's one of the fun things about it's the opposite of what we were talking about, being in a courtroom and seeing these people whose lives are devastated. You're seeing somebody who's another sort of global star having this peak moment, and the energy that he unlike Belichick, Brady was pretty juiced. He was pretty excited, but he was also exhausted, and they're trying to ask him. People are asking him questions, and he was. I mean, it was interesting because there were foreign reporters there and trying to ask him questions in English, which wasn't their first language. And Brady to his credit, he was being so polite and patient. And it was just people like, what were you thinking on third down and such and such and such? And he's, wait, which play was that? He couldn't remember because it had all been so compressed and intense. And he's, I don't know, a lot of stuff happened out there. But he just said, what he kept coming back to, they were like, what did you think? Did you think the game was lost when you were down this, whatever? And how do you get yourself excited for that? And Brady just said, you just keep trying, down by down, play by play. And in the nugget of all that was also what I'm saying was like, and I think we can all relate to that about we've all been down and we've all had to come back from something. And it's like, here he is at this high level, and you just have to go back to the basics of putting one foot in front of the other and just keep trying play by play. So that was a really cool moment. That was that's the opposite of sitting in a committee meeting waiting for the conferees to show up kind of thing at the Capitol.
Exactly. What are the type of questions at a Lady Gaga press conference about her being at the Super Bowl? Like, what are people asking her? Like songs, what she's gonna wear? I don't know what's the Q&A focused on.
All of that. And I wasn't asking any questions because I wasn't writing off it. Again, I felt like I was there as a tourist for the bigger picture stuff. But yes, all of that. And actually, she was similarly inspiring in a way. People were asking her about how she talked about how she'd prepared for it. And to hear her tell it, she'd spent, I don't know, months planning this out and trying to do something really special and rehearsing. And it's not like she just shows up and somebody hands her a costume. So they were asking about that. And she also gave some sort of, I don't know, if somebody asked her, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who wanted to get into music? And I do remember at one point, one of her answers was like, you just got to believe in yourself and live it and work it and give it everything you got, something like that. But it's a lot of, some of it can be cheesy. Somebody asked Chris Martin, the Coldplay one, what songs are you going to play? And he was like, I'm not going to tell you, kind of thing. Yeah, it's everything from what do you eat for breakfast before something like that. Like, nobody asked that. But it's all sorts of, there's nothing real profound going on at these press conferences.
When I first got involved in politics, around the same time you were first reporting, social media wasn't really around. I remember my first campaign, there was one computer that had the internet and no one was allowed to use it. And so it's roused. And I've disclosed this on my podcast before that my wife and my kids don't have a big social media presence. They know how to use it because I generally think that social media is something, particularly for kids, they're going to think is as healthy as smoking cigarettes. And one of the things I wanted to discuss with you is that intersection of being a journalist on social media. Now you're a columnist, writing, comment section. I think that, and one of the things that I've consistently said is I would never say anything on social media that I wouldn't say to someone's face. My mom's still alive. She reads my social media, so I try to cut down on the swearing as much as I can. But That intersection and the access that the public has, I think journalists and meteorologists get hit the most on social media. That's generally my take. How do you, as someone who tries to have that kind of respectful dialogue, but you're in the opinion side, how do you balance the criticism and feedback you get about reporting your stories? How do you balance getting that type of feedback? And then also engage and also try to be thoughtful in a very unthoughtful medium, which is social media.
I don't think I tend not to. I don't think I engage a lot on social media about, I'm not going to get into a debate with someone on social media. And now it feels so, because it feels so, I don't know, violent. It's, if I spent a lot of time on there, that would be terrible for my mental health and all my health. That's not,
Correct.
and I think I'll tell you what, man, I just read the book about Facebook, Careless People. And one of the things the author talks about was how all these tech titans in Silicon Valley they don't let their kids on social media. They don't have
Correct.
screens because they know how damaging it is. And I'm an adult. I'm a veteran journalist, but I'm not going to go on there and get in fights with people. I will post my stories and then back away or something like that, if I even post them. Sometimes I'll just let the Star Tribune sort of general channels do that. But it's just insane because people are on there with hiding behind, and people don't even use their real names. And they're saying the kind of things to me that certainly no one's ever said to my face. It's
Yep.
toxic. And so I don't have a good answer. I'm not out there engaging with people on social media a lot anymore. I don't miss it. But some people do it more, but I just think it's gotten so difficult. That could take over your life.
Absolutely. My father would call me. He's since passed away, but he would read the comments and be like, "Hey, Michael, just see what was on the comments." I'm like, "Dad, don't read the comments. Don't ever read the comments." And I try to tell my mom the same. Don't read the comments. Never read the comments. But social media can be, and because it's so interesting, because I think the farther we get removed away from people who weren't born with social media and being around, I think we're losing a little bit of that human connection, that like interpersonal skills. I think we're diminishing a bit away from that. So I was just curious how you balance that.
No, I don't really. I feel like the less time I spend on social media, the better off I am for it. I do
Yep.
I scroll, I doom scroll, I scroll a lot because there are people who are good at being funny and quippy and informative on some channels. Some certain people I like, but then you'll be scrolling through it. I'll be scrolling through it and I'll be like, wait, you don't even know. And your brain's trying to figure out, okay, what's this tweet saying and who's tweeting it and what angle are they coming from? So what are they being sarcastic? What are they really trying to say? It's just a total brain twister.
Yep.
And I'm like, oh man, I need to go read a book or go for a walk or watch the
Yes.
Timberwolves or something on TV, because I literally feel it not being healthy for my brain.
One of the things we touched on a little bit is you did straight reporting, and sometimes there'd be people pushing back and on the edges of what information gets into the story. What's your take on misinformation right now, the prevalence of it and the challenge of it? Because it's a subject, again, as a parent, we're all, and even with kids having limited social media access and trying to prepare them for misinformation, how, as a journalist, the amount of time you spent, have you seen more evidence of misinformation creeping into standard information and people embracing it more or believing it?
Oh, for sure. And again, I just read that book, and this is the name of the game in social media, is algorithms and trying to push propaganda or misinformation to people. And there's certainly plenty of people who would argue that this is how Trump has won two times, is through the prevalence of this, and how sometimes you'll be talking to someone and they'll refer to a news source and wait, that's not a legitimate news source. That's just some sort of propaganda channel. Oh man, yeah, it's just huge, and it's a huge problem. And I think we're seeing it, and it's fueling our politics and division, I think, because we don't have to go back too far to see where everybody read the paper. I read a legitimate news source. And I would encourage people to find trusted news sources that are journalistically sound and have integrity, as opposed to they're trying to just present one side of a half picture and a half truth and get you to believe a certain thing or support a certain candidate. But I think it's a very big challenge for my industry.
Somebody's cousin on Facebook can be very persuasive.
Absolutely. And as these things get better and better, as people are able to produce stories that look like news stories, or right, and chat the AI on all that, and people, and it's even hard sometimes for me that I'll read something and be like, well, that makes sense. But then it'll be like, I will go and find 2 or 3 other sources that sort of can debunk that credibly. But I think a lot of people, I'm a trained journalist and I'm a veteran journalist. So I know how to go, I know where to go to find that stuff. But a teenager or a 20 something or a lot of anybody who don't have that background, it's going to be a lot harder.
I was in my car in Egan on Mother's Day with my family, and we passed a car that had a bumper sticker that said, "Honk if you don't think Helen Keller is real." And I said to my kids, I said, is there a belief that Helen Keller wasn't a real person? And lo and behold, there was. And for the rest of the car ride, we discussed how there's a growing consensus of people out there who do not believe that Helen Keller was real. And I'm like, what world? I'm also dealing with people who think we didn't land on the moon and that 9/11 was an inside job and that the earth is flat and stuff like that. It's just a crazy time. It's just a crazy time of misinformation.
It's also much more mainstream than that, Michael, as you know, that January 6th was a bunch of tourists.
Correct.
Yeah. And I had a legislator here who's a former civics teacher said that when they first started in the business, I started teaching that, it's taught civics and it was history. And you talk about the Holocaust. And this is an inner ring suburb, a pretty middle of the road suburb. And initially the kids would come in acknowledging that the Holocaust was bad. But then in recent years that this would be a discussion that this teacher would have to build this case. I don't know if that was a lack of them not believing the Holocaust happened or that it wasn't a bad thing. I don't know. But and this is someone I trust, just that things had really shifted somehow.
Cheers and jeers. Your column, your weekly column. Let's talk about the genesis of it and what you're trying. I read it. What's the basis behind it and what you're trying to do?
I guess I would say I was trying to have some fun and be creative. And when I applied for this current job, I pitched that as something I would do if I got the job. And you know how it is when you apply for a job, you kind of like, maybe I will, maybe I won't, maybe they won't like it. But then I got into the job, and after 2 weeks, I used to write when I was on the Paul Gump team right before I switched jobs. I wrote we have a daily newsletter, and I wrote it every Friday, and I liked that because it was fun and an opportunity to be a little looser and a little more creative and a little more playful than you could be in a news story. And so I was looking for another outlet for that, to have a little more fun and not just be taking on heavy topics all the time. And also fun for me to write, to weigh in on things that wouldn't necessarily be a full column, but might have been something notable in the news. And so in some ways it was just sort of a creative outlet for me. And I guess it has been kind of, but people seem to like it because I think people like little digestible chunks. And and
I also
go ahead.
I also like your use of alliteration.
Cheers and jeers.
No, in your remember the newsletter, you're
right.
The alliteration that you would constantly go with. It's quite good. It's quite impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're coming back with another newsletter for the opinion pages. So stay tuned.
That's great.
Yeah.
You have had a career it's covered so many different subjects. You mean it's been sports, criminal trials, local government, and now you're doing opinion columnist. What advice would you have for someone for aspiring journalists, for people who are trying to get into being a journalist, as someone has such the rich experience that you have? What advice would you give to someone who's starting and maybe listening to this interview and thinking about a career in journalism or just about to enter that? What advice would you have?
That's a good question. I would say generally, I would encourage people going into any field to sort of sample a lot of things. I think I came to it out of journalism school. I was interested in getting a job, and I got a job with the Associated Press. And I knew that working at the Associated Press, part of that was I knew it was good. I knew you had to be a generalist because at the AP, you have to write about a lot of different things. And that's what I did the first night early in my career. I started with the AP in Kansas City. I'm from Minnesota. It started with the AP in Kansas City, and then I spent 3 years in West Virginia, a place I probably never would have seen if I hadn't gotten a job there with the AP. And I remember I rolled in there and I'm like, I don't know anything about coal mining. I didn't even know they still mined coal. They do. And obviously, and I remember even talking to my boss at the time, like, how am I going to figure out coal mining? And he was like, oh, you can handle this. Just you can give it 6 months or whatever. And I wasn't I wasn't the main coal reporter, but still it was daunting. It was a life and a lifestyle and a job I wasn't familiar with. But so I guess I think, and at the AP, I also knew I was going to have to write about sports. Although I grew up in Minnesota again, I grew up like in Minnesota sports and sports teams, and I was involved in watching them. So that was easy. But I would encourage people to sample, to not think you have to be on a certain path right away, to look around and be open to things that you might not know about. And literally my boss, when I said that about coal mining, if you got a job on an oil rig and that was your job to cover offshore oil rigging, I would expect you to be a national expert in offshore oil rigging in 6 months. And I was like, okay. And I think buried underneath that sort of tough love or whatever was him saying, you can figure this out. And so I don't know, just be open to, now it's like there's so much. When I started in this industry, it was just print, right? And now here we are on this podcast. And that's a big part of the Star Tribune too, is podcasts and talking and social media and that stuff we envisioned 20 years ago. Just be open, but also be willing to work hard and don't say no to stuff. You never know. I'd always been interested in politics. Again, I grew up in Minnesota. I was somewhat aware of politics because I feel like politics are a big part of Minnesota life. We grew up Humphrey Mondale those years, and then Boschwitz and all that. So there was always something interesting here, but it wasn't. I didn't go into journalism thinking I want to write about politics. Part of the reason I agreed to my first State House job was because the AP at the time had every session they would hire it was called legislative relief, where they'd bring in somebody on a temporary basis to help out just for the legislative session. And I knew I wanted a job, and so I thought, it would behoove me to be interested in covering the legislature. And so that was my first session was in Topeka, Kansas, and I liked it right away. And part of covering the legislature is, as literally 1 minute I'd be sitting there in Topeka writing about the motorcycle helmet laws, and then the next day I'd be writing about corporate hog farming. And I'm from Bloomington. I didn't know anything about corporate hog farming, but just the array. I liked the array of topics and just try to be adaptable and be enthusiastic. That's a big part of it, is say yes to stuff and don't say, oh no, I'm not interested in that. I want to be a CBS Sunday morning anchor or whatever. It's no, most of us anyway, have to put in the grunt work. So say yes to stuff and be enthusiastic. And I think that goes a long way in any profession.
I think you're spot on, and that's a great place to end this. I appreciate so much of your time. And I will also say, I wanted to have you on because I've known you for so long, but in prepping for this interview, I was so impressed by the depth of subjects that you've covered that it really, really I knew that this interview was going to be more impactful because you've covered a lot of subjects and been able to balance that. And that takes a skill. And that's a real sign of your professionalism, your desire to learn the subjects. And I think it's what makes you such a good journalist, now columnist, and in any capacity that you're there covering the story, Minnesotans are going to get a good view of what's going on. So I really appreciate you coming on today. Okay.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the thoughtful questions. That's you really did your homework, Michael. I got to hand it, but I'm not surprised. You always have. So
I appreciate that so much, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at BB BreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you so much for joining us.